Hello and welcome to a new episode of That Fertile Feeling, the podcast. My name is Françoise, and on today's episode we're stepping into very deep territory. We're going to be talking about mitochondria, intergenerational trauma, and the womb. And that might sound like a surprising combination, but by the end of this episode you'll understand how, the mitochondria, which are like the tiniest structures in your cell, how they can carry the weight of generations, and how through healing we can reclaim our power at the deepest level. Now, this episode is also a special invitation into the Sovereign Womb, which is my new 10-week course, which is rooted in trauma-informed, embody-led, and ancestral reconnection, but we'll get to that later. First, let's begin with the science. So what are these mitochondria that I'm talking about? We've mentioned them before on the podcast. Mitochondria, they're often called the powerhouses of the cell. So mitochondria, they are responsible for producing the energy that powers everything in your body, from your brain function to hormonal signaling to egg quality. But they're more than that. The mitochondria, they're also storytellers. They hold memories, they carry lineage. They really sustain the pulse of life in every cell in your body. Now, what's important to know about mitochondria is that they have their own DNA. It's known as mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, distinct from the DNA in your cell nucleus. I'll just call it, for simplicity purposes, I'll just call it DNA on this episode, but know that I'm talking about mitochondrial DNA here. Now, what's so special about this mitochondrial DNA is that it's passed down only through your mother line. Like, at conception, the sperm, it just sort of loses its mitochondrial DNA and makes sure that only that maternal mitochondrial DNA gets passed on. And that means that the energy in your body today, the energy in all of those cells, it carries the echoes from your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother. You can trace that mitochondrial DNA all the way back to the first mother ever. And I find that an incredibly powerful image. I want to talk to you about these mitochondria today because they are so vital to your well-being, to your fertility. Because when mitochondrial function is optimal, we feel vibrant, we feel intuitive, fertile, strong. But what often happens with these mitochondria is that they become damaged or overwhelmed. And we see the consequences of that throughout the entire body. I've been reading a lot of studies this week. And they connect these mitochondrial damages to conditions like Alzheimer's, to metabolic diseases such as diabetes, mood disorders, PTSD, even infertility, like things like poor egg quality, reduced implantation, early miscarriage. It's not always the case, but often they can be traced back to damaged mitochondrial DNA. So, for me, this feels like a really important message. Your mitochondria are not just energy generators, they're really gatekeepers of your cellular legacy. They're keepers of your inner fire, that spark within you, the pulse of your creativity, vitality, intuitive knowing. It's stoked and sustained by these ancient maternal powerhouses. So when your mitochondria are thriving, that fire within you that burns steady. But when they're exhausted, the flame dims. And the reason why that happens is because that mitochondrial DNA is quite delicate. It doesn't have the same kind of protection as the other DNA in your cells. And that is because mitochondria are the place where your cells make energy. So they're constantly exposed to the exhaust of that energy making process. It's just like when we used to burn, wood in our houses, you get a lot of exhaust. In technical terms, you would call that free radicals and oxidative stress. Now, if your body is in balance, your body can handle that. But when you're exposed to repeated stress, and that can be toxins in your environment, a poor diet, chronic inflammation, emotional stress, it becomes too much for your mitochondria to manage. They get overwhelmed. And what happens is then the DNA in these mitochondria, it gets damaged, or parts of it get shut down. So that means that your cells, they make less energy, that inflammation goes up, and the whole system starts to feel off, tired, out of balance. It's really the body's energy factories. They begin sending out distress signals instead of power. So that's when things start to shift from vitality to dysfunction. And this can actually leave a lasting mark on your system, because that stress, it leaves. So these are all biochemical processes, really. And what that stress does, and I'm not talking about, what we normally understand as stress. I'm talking like about the toxins, again, pollution, bad nutrition, a poor diet. Those are all stresses on your body. They set into motion a biochemical process, and that changes the way in which your genes express themselves. So it's not necessarily that they rewrite the genes, but they influence your body's ability to write the genes. So they can silence some genes, they can activate others. And that, can have these really adverse health effects. It can shape everything from your immune response to your emotional regulation, your fertility. So it's a bit technical maybe to recap. Your cells, they contain these energy factories called mitochondria. These can get damaged by repeated stressors, and over time this can change your body's ability to read the genes, to act on the genes in your body. Now, there's a lot of stressors that can play a role here. I wanted to focus on one specifically, trauma, because trauma is one of the most potent stressors for mitochondria. And we often think of trauma as something that lives in the mind, but more and more research is coming out now. There's the great book, The Body Keeps the Score. Trauma actually lives in the body. It lives in the tissues, it lives in the muscles, and it lives in your cells. And mitochondria are actually some of the first responders to trauma. Whether that trauma is emotional neglect, war, talking about a big trauma, but also childhood abuse, infertility trauma, generational disconnect. All these types of trauma, they can initiate what scientists now call a mitochondrial storm. I thought that was a quite captivating image. What happens is when you experience stress of this kind, the body releases excess cortisol, inflammatory signals, so it's telling your body like it's in danger. If there's too much of this, it overwhelms the mitochondria, which begin to malfunction. Remember that exhaust I was talking about? There's so much exhaust that the mitochondria just don't know what to do anymore. In that chaos, they start to release fragments of their DNA into the bloodstream. So that's really a way for them to trigger an immune response. They release that DNA into the blood, showing all of your systems in the body like we have like a big threat going on, and we need a systemic immune response. There's a really great study I found. It was called the Marine Resiliency Project, where researchers, they followed US Marines before and after deployment. And what they found is that soldiers who later developed PTSD, they had significantly higher levels of those DNA fragments in their blood. And that happened long before their psychological symptoms fully emerged. So what these fragments did in the blood is that they activated immune pathways and inflammation. It was mistaken then by the immune system as a sign of an infection or danger, so it responded as it would to a virus. And it triggered a whole cascade of inflammatory responses, which basically keep the body in a prolonged state of alert. And then when the body is on high alert and it remains on high alert, that's when you see chronic symptoms associated with PTSD appearing. So there can be fatigue, hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, immune dysfunction. That's how trauma becomes biology. It's a chemical process. Now, and that's also why I wanted to record this episode today, is that we are starting to learn that these mitochondrial changes, also the changes, caused by trauma, they are passed on from mother to child. As I mentioned, right? Your mitochondria, they are passed on from mother to child through the egg. So it's not the paternal DNA that matters here, it's all the maternal mitochondrial DNA. Not everything makes it through to the child. There's only a small selection. It's called the mitochondrial bottleneck. So a small selection of that DNA that makes it through. So if that DNA is healthy, that's a blessing. And of course, there's a little bit of selection going on there. But it can also happen that damaged or silenced DNA is passed on to the child. You remember I said it's not that the genes themselves are changed, but the body's ability to read them. That's what then is passed on to the child, and it's subsequently amplified because there's so much cell replication happening during pregnancy, right? We have a big baby growing from that initial set of the initial one cell. So all of those mitochondrial defects get amplified. So if that mother had DNA that was significantly changed by trauma, she passes that on at a biochemical level to her child. I found a great study. It was done in 2023 of over 750 mother-baby pairs. And the researchers, they sought to understand how a mother's early life experiences, including various forms of childhood adversity, might shape the biology of her child. So these mothers, they filled in a detailed questionnaire where they documented their exposure to different types of trauma, so emotional abuse, emotional neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, household dysfunction. And then the researchers, they also collected cord blood samples from the babies at birth to look at their genetic expression to see what had been passed on. And what they found, I thought, was really striking. It wasn't the most visible or dramatic forms of trauma that left the strongest imprint, but the more subtle and the more insidious ones. So emotional abuse and neglect. These forms of trauma, they were associated with, we call that then gene expression, so changes in the baby's gene expression, which were linked to emotional regulation, brain development, and immune functioning. So if a mother had experienced emotional abuse or neglect when she was young, she was more likely to have a baby with problematic emotional regulation, brain development, and immune functioning. That's how that got passed on. And I wondered why emotional abuse and neglect. What the researchers suggest is that these experiences, because they occur silently and they persist over long periods, that they may create a chronic level of stress without any outlet, really. So that leads to a prolonged activation of the stress system, unlike acute trauma, which, is more often acknowledged and responded to. That emotional neglect, it often goes unseen. It just leaves the nervous system in a long-term state of unsafety. And this chronic dysregulation may explain why it leaves such a deep biological imprint even decades later. Now, another thing, and that's the final technical thing I'll mention, and then I'll also touch on some of the things you can do to make sure that the trauma ends with you. So it's not just that mitochondrial DNA that you pass on that creates an imprint, but what happens during the pregnancy that also shapes the baby's development at the cellular level. This is something that research showed in animal models. So in one study, the researchers exposed pregnant mice to these repeated mild stressors. So there was, I think it was restraints and unpredictable light-dark cycles. And they did that during a critical window of gestation. These were not necessarily physically harmful stressors. So it was just about restricting movement and not having a predictable rhythm throughout the day when it comes to light and dark. And thereby they try to mimic sort of the psychological stress that many humans face during pregnancy, especially if you think about light-dark circles. We're on our phones all the time, even at night, so we get exposed to light at strange times, right? So that is a stressor already. And the goal was then to observe whether this prenatal stress alone could impact the biological and emotional development of the offspring. And the results were profound. So the offspring, who had never directly experienced any trauma, they showed these genetic imprints, these genetic expressions linked to reduced energy production in brain tissue, increased emotional reactivity and anxiety-like behavior. So that was already quite significant. But what's even more incredible is that these changes were passed to the second generation. So it wasn't just the babies of these mothers who were stressed that carried that genetic imprint, it was also their grandchildren. And this is not to scare anyone. It's to validate the profound influence that pregnancy has. It's to underline how deeply our cells, our nervous systems are listening to our environments, because I feel that's also where the power lies. When we understand how this imprinting happens, we can begin to change the story. As I said, it's not the genes that are changed, it's our body's ability to read these genes. And we can choose to tend to our nervous system, to reconnect with safety, to nourish our inner world, knowing that every act of care, every breath of calm it helps your body sort of recuperate what was lost. And this is how the cycle begins to end. This is how healing becomes real lineage work. So how do you heal? What's interesting when I went through the literature is that, so you have this extreme technical story, right, about DNA and biochemical processes, but then when it comes down to, okay, so what should we be doing? It's actually some of the things we mention on the podcast all the time. So have a good nutrition, getting enough vitamins like folate and B12. Well, if you're trying to conceive, that's something you're focusing on already, probably, right? Movement and exercise, not too much, because if you're doing high intensity training all the time, that's another form of stress on your body, on your cells. But having regular moderate exercise, that's can even set into motion a process by which new healthy mitochondria are formed. Stress reduction and somatic healing practices to regulate the nervous system. Those are proven ways to calm inflammation and to enable the body to shift from survival mode into healing and regeneration. So it's not rocket science. It's about taking good care of yourself, getting regular movement, getting good food, making sure that you're dealing with stress levels. Not that you aren't exposed to any stress at all, but that you find a way to regulate your nervous system on a daily basis. There's one thing I wanted to mention in particular because I found that very fascinating, and that is the element of community and ancestral reconnection. I found a study that reminds us that healing is not just about adopting these practices, but it's also about creating a sense of belonging. What they showed in this study, the researchers, is that in indigenous communities, the trauma of colonization and cultural erasure that continue to show up generations later as increased rates of chronic disease, of metabolic function, and mental health struggles. In one review, the researchers looked in particular at maternal and even grandmaternal exposure to cultural disruption. So they looked at things like putting kids in residential schools where they weren't allowed to have their own customs or talk in their own language. It was very, very... There was a lot of abuse going on there as well, so it's horrible. Other practices of cultural disruption are things like land displacement, just in general, the loss of traditional practices. And they found a clear link with an increased incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, anxiety in the descendants of these women. And this is because of the mechanisms that we discussed today. It's because trauma altered the mitochondrial function in these pregnant women, which then shaped the biology of the fetus. But that's not all. What these studies also found is that, so obviously these experiences, they disrupted access to traditional healing practices, to language, to ceremony. So they also cut off the very tools that once supported regulation, resilience, and repair. So, crucially, the research found that when cultural reconnection programs were implemented, so there was a restoring of traditional knowledge, there were land-based practices, intergenerational storytelling, the biological markers of stress and inflammation improved. And I feel that many of us are already starting to sense it, that healing happens not just within us, but between us, in community, in ritual, and in remembrance. And that's what I call mitochondrial medicine. And this is where the Sovereign Womb begins, my upcoming 10-week program, which is not really a course. It's a framework for repair, I call it. It's a step-by-step way to tend to your nervous system, to restore your mitochondrial health, and to create the internal conditions where healing can happen, not just for you, but for the lineage that follows. So over those 10 weeks, we move from understanding trauma's imprint to changing it. And I use science-backed education, somatic tools. I also very much focus on that community support to teach you how to calm your nervous system and shift out of fight or flight, how to reduce the inflammation that keeps you stuck in survival mode, how to reignite your body's natural energy and vitality by supporting mitochondrial health, how to rewrite emotional and ancestral patterns stored in the womb and the body. And we'll walk through the historical erasure of womb wisdom in ancient Europe. We'll look at the somatic architecture of your pelvic bowl, so any trauma you might be holding there. We'll do shadow work. We'll look at womb trauma. We'll focus on these ancestral imprints, and we'll also very much focus on connecting to the womb as a site of forgiveness, of creativity, joy, rebirth, all of it grounded in real tools. So I work with trance journeys, mythology lectures, somatic rituals, life ceremonies to really help you create that lasting change. So this work, its main focus is to help you feel better, to help you improve your fertility, but it will also definitely help you rewire the signals you're sending to your body, your future children, and the generations to come. So if you've been looking for a way to heal that honors both science and soul, this is it. And you can join the waitlist now at thatfertilefeeling.com/womb. There's a waitlist now so that you can access the early bird price for the 10-week course. The early bird price is €249. I've tried to keep it accessible for everyone, but there is so much information in there. So let this be your threshold moment. Let this be your return to safety and to just optimal cellular health, really. And the point where that ancestral trauma ends. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me on Instagram at thatfertilefeeling or email me at francoise@thatfertilefeeling.com. I always love to hear from you, and I always get back to you and hope to see you back in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.